What do you think is the most interesting psychology phenomenon? False memories. How you can implant false memories in someone over time. And they believe they are real and their reactions are based on their own reality. I'm amazed at the number of people who freeze in a disastrous situation like a sinking ship. People who've survived tragedies like that always report that there's not nearly the amount of panic and confusion that you'd expect. A lot of people freeze in place and simply can't move, even as the water is rising around them. Families have been split up in situations like this, where two of them can move, but the other three can't. We tend to hate people that have the same flaws and make the same mistakes as we do. Dreaming. Even though everyone does it, it's amazing that our minds create virtual realities for us nightly. If you can lucid dream, it can be more entertaining than any game technology has invented. The placebo effect. The idea that belief in something can actually have a positive impact on the body just seems so crazy to me. Also helped me realize inversely why stress and anxiety can take such a toll on you. Playing. When two animals play with each other, they both communicate aggression, they show fangs, claws, they bite, they go for the neck, etc. Everything about it should communicate danger, but they never feel endangered, even when one animal accidentally hurts another. This happens even when animals are playing with animals they have barely known for some time. It blows my mind how the right context completely transforms all the communication between animals who play. Déjà vu. To have such a strong feeling that an instance has happened before is crazy. Like you experienced it in the past, or dreamed of it. When Japanese tourists go to Paris, see how not romantic it is, and have crippling panic attacks. The amount that the words we use, and think in, changes how we act. People who speak Spanish are less likely to blame someone for dropping something, because the language is the thing was dropped rather than you dropped the thing. Australian Aborigines have no words for left, right etc. Instead they use north, east, south, and west. As a result, they almost always know what direction they are facing, even inside buildings with no exterior view. Deaf children in Africa using a made-up sign language had not developed signs for describing positioning, under, over, to the right of etc., and when tested, they could not find a hidden object, even when they watched it be hidden. They couldn't tell themselves in their own minds where to look for it, and so they couldn't find it. For me it is the unconscious mind and the fact that it accounts for the majority of our cognitive activity. I think it's interesting how we can simultaneously both know and not know things. It is also interesting, and perhaps even frightening, that we are not running the show to the extent that we think we are, at least not consciously. The bystander effect. Everyone thinks they would help if something happens, but the effect says that the more people there are, the less someone is going to help. How laughter affects people. Laughter is basically the yin to stress's yang, which inspires me to make people laugh when I can, as I don't know what they're going through. Laughter increases things like dopamine, and can even help soothe physical pain sometimes. Synesthesia. This happens when you experience one sensory stimulus and it triggers another. For example, you hear a splash and think of the color blue. I get this quite vividly with tastes. If I see a plastic fork, I always taste ketchup for some reason. Dissociative disorders. A dissociative disorder is a mental disorder that involves experiencing a disconnection and lack of continuity between thoughts, memories, surroundings, actions and identity. People with dissociative disorders escape reality in ways that are involuntary and unhealthy and cause problems with functioning in everyday life. If you get yourself to be really happy and excited to see other people, they will react the same to you. It doesn't always happen the first time, but it will definitely happen next time. Time and again this has always worked fine for me. The gambler's fallacy, specifically, how the same series of events can lead to two different conclusions. Assume you have a perfectly fair coin, you toss it 5 times and get 5 heads. You then ask 2 people what they think the 6th toss will be. Person A thinks that heads is obviously on a roll, so he bets on heads. Person B thinks that heads has happened too many times, which means that tails has to come up, so he bets on tails. They're both wrong. The odds of the 6th throw remain the same, regardless of what happened in the past. Note that this only works if the coin is fair. Why do people have favorites? Like a favorite color or a favorite flower? Planning fallacy. We always believe that things will take less time than they do, even when we've done this activity before. It's very strange to me. Phantom limb syndrome. The ability to feel sensations and even pain in a limb or limbs that no longer exist. Phantom limb syndrome is characterized by both non-painful and painful sensations. Non-painful sensations can be divided into the perception of movement and the perception of external sensations, exteroception, including touch, temperature, pressure, vibration, and itch. Pain sensations range from burning and shooting pains to feelings of tingling pins and needles. While phantom limb syndrome occurs only in amputees, phantom sensations may be perceived in people who have survived strokes but lost function of certain body parts or who have spinal cord injury or peripheral nerve injury. Phantom limb syndrome was first described in 1552 by French surgeon Ambroise Bère, who operated on wounded soldiers and wrote about patients who complained of pain in amputated limbs. The same syndrome was later observed and noted by French scientist, mathematician, and philosopher René Descartes, German physician Aaron Lemos, Scottish anatomist Sir Charles Bell, and American physician Silas Weir Mitchell, who tended to wounded soldiers in Philadelphia during the American Civil War. Scottish physician William Porterfield wrote a first-hand account of phantom limb syndrome in the 18th century, following the amputation of one of his legs. He was the first person to consider sensory perception as the underlying phenomenon of the syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is pretty interesting. You probably all know what it is already, but for anyone who doesn't, it's when a victim of kidnapping falls in love with their kidnapper, and it's more common than you'd think. How people who hate themselves hate people who like them. Mass hysteria. The fact that our brains can cause us to have symptoms of something serious just because of rumors and fear is pretty crazy. The effect of a person's environment, expectations and upbringing on schizophrenia. Specifically schizophrenics that hear voices/hallucinate. In a lot of societies, these voices are usually aggressive, dark, cruel, or they simply torture the one experiencing them, calling names and undermining them. In others, usually more spiritual societies, the voices are calm, benevolent and actively trying to help the listener. It is thought that this is the result from how those societies see the schizophrenic. In most, it's seen as a horrible mental disease, in popular culture and media even dangerous. This stigma gives the person involved a negative view of their mental condition, and causes them to internally demonize it. And exactly that creates the evil voices. They believe it is negative, so it becomes more negative. After all, the voices are a figment of their own imagination. In some cultures, schizophrenics aren't labeled that, but are seen as shamans or priests, or a gifted person with a strong spiritual connection. The voices are interpreted as guides, deceased ancestors, or even God's self. They don't perceive it as an evil, so the voices do not become evil. The person hearing them doesn't suffer that much from it. Of course, feeling a sense of grandeur because of your mental state is also not a healthy thing, but for the one involved it is a better alternative than being tortured by voices, telling you you're trash or that you should do horrible things, or just screaming, making noise. It can be treated with antipsychotics, to a certain degree, but it would be lovely if one day we as a society could look at schizophrenia in a more healthy manner, so that those who have it aren't as plagued by it, because they have a more neutral view of it. I hope it is possible, someday. I'm going to psych nerd out a bit, since I did research on this phenomenon, but facial information processing errors associated with depression are super interesting. Folks with major depressive disorder, MDD, are actually way more likely than their peers to misidentify and selectively focus on emotional responses from other people. They have a much higher risk of misperceiving neutral faces as negative, and for missing facial cues that indicate positive information. At the same time, folks with MDD are also much better at noticing negative facial emotion indicators. Similarly, people with anxiety disorders tend to be much more likely to see neutral faces as angry. I find it really interesting because it shows how a mood disorder like depression is way more complex than we sometimes give it credit for. Information processing problems can be triggered by, and in turn reinforce, someone's depression. If we focus just on mood as our metric for what constitutes recovery, we miss some really interesting and potentially useful ways to provide treatment. How fans of opposing teams, from the same country, can hate each other with such passion. Hate that boils over to reasons completely unrelated to the teams or the sport itself. Furthermore, when the fan's team wins, the fan translates the team's success into personal gain, most often taking on a smug attitude. Head down to the Ole Miss vs Mississippi State game this year and you can cut the tension with a knife. I'm not sure if it counts, but sleep paralysis is really interesting to me and I think it could be linked to mental health. Definitely the Dunning-Kruger effect. My friend taught me about it when my dad was being difficult. Denial. The many answers to evade the truth are very creative. Right now, how psychology influences elections and political affiliations. Some of it is really depressing, like name recognition or even a candidate's last name have an effect on how people vote. I wish I still had the study, but it found people like to select simple last names. So Joe Smith will beat out John Jacob Jingleheimer Schmidt, policy is irrelevant.